Track 11, Good Morning, Good Morning. Of all the tracks on Sgt. Pepper, it's Good Morning, Good Morning that benefits the most from Giles Martin's 2017 remix. I'll be honest, I love the Sgt. Pepper album. I love every song on the album. But if I had to pick a least favorite song, it would be Good Morning, Good Morning. Sgt. Pepper is an album about a fantasy band. The album opens as a fantasy concert, and dreamlike musical and lyrical motifs play throughout. And perhaps that's why it's always felt a bit out of place with the rest of the album. The whole album itself feels very blissful. Even in what I perceive to be its darker moments, there is still this underlying blissfulness to it. But Good Morning feels erratic and out of place with the rest of the album. At first you might think that a darker dream is beginning to intrude on your blissful one, but then you realize it's the waking world that's intruding. The song deals with John Lennon's dissatisfaction with suburban home life, and there is a manic-depressive feel to it. A lot of that manic-depressive feel comes from how its musical timing is structured. From a music theory standpoint, Good Morning is strangely structured for a pop song. First of all, and as I have implied before in other videos, writing a pop song outside of standard 4/4 time is not common, and when it does happen, it is by itself unusual. Writing a pop song that switches between time signatures is even more unusual. Good Morning switches time signatures 3 times. The song's first 4 measures are in the comfortable 4/4 time. The next 3 are in 5/4 time, before jumping to 3/4 time for just 1 measure, before jumping back to 4/4 time, or what is sometimes referred to as common time. And I believe that it's the song's awkward time signature jumps that do the most to create this song's effect of feeling disoriented. In this case, it's the disorientation John feels when faced with what I'm guessing must have been the banality of suburban life sinking into the head of someone who has for years now been living a life extraordinary. This makes sense when you consider that one of the song's inspirations was a Kellogg's Cornflakes commercial, and that the lyrical reference to "It's time for tea and meet the wife" refers to a British sitcom about a henpecked husband. And again, I doubt that John Lennon was ever thinking, oh yeah, if I go from 4/4 to 5/4 to 3/4, it will create the vibe I'm going for. I get the impression that he had no idea what he was doing from a music theory perspective. I'm guessing he knew instinctively the feel he was going for. He picked up his guitar, and I think he just let his instincts guide him all the way, not once stopping to think, wait, what the hell time signature is this in? Just like I said with Lovely Rita, unintentionally interesting and even brilliant musical choices. And getting back to my opening statement about this track benefiting the most from the Giles Martin remix, in the remix, Mr. Martin gives a bit of a tweak to where the guitars sit in the mix, giving the guitars, and thus the song, a much stronger and harder edge that it didn't have previously. In the hands of Giles Martin, Good Morning now sounds more like a precursor to the White Album. Track 12, Sgt. Pepper, Reprise. As I said before, Sgt. Pepper is an album about a fantasy band playing a fantasy concert, and we return full force to this theme in the Reprise. We hear Paul give a count-off, and George, or is it John, I'm not really sure, say in the background, goodbye. The first thing that hits me is how much heavier and stripped down the Sgt. Pepper Reprise is from its opening track predecessor. Ringo kicks out one of his most straightforwardly heavy rock drum beats ever on this track. When I listen to Ringo's drum beat, I can kind of imagine that Gene Simmons and or Paul Stanley of Kiss might have pointed to Ringo's drum beat when telling Peter Criss how they wanted their hit, Rock and Roll All Night, to open. The guitar, bass, and drum riffs that open the Reprise predates a lot of heavy FM rock that will start to become more prevalent in the 70s and 80s. The opening Sgt. Pepper is relaxed and chill compared to the closing Sgt. Pepper. Gone are the horns and the light classical music arrangements from George Martin. Instead, it's just the four lads rocking out hard. My only complaint about the Reprise is that it just ends too quickly. Or does it? Paul shouts out to the audience, the final chord is strummed, and the crowd roars. But before the audience can even have a chance to die down, there is... I'm sorry, pardon me while I digress. You know, if there is any one thing to dispel the superstitious notions regarding the number 13, it is the presence of track 13. A Day in the Life. This is the big one. The song opens with the applause fading from the Sgt. Pepper Reprise. John's acoustic guitar fades in and floats above it. Enter a very majestically played piano chord. The concert is over, but something even more amazing is about to begin. Enter John Lennon's opening vocal, which George Martin would years later describe as spine-chilling. I read the news today, oh boy, about a lucky man who made the grade. And though the news was rather sad, well, I just had to laugh. I saw the photograph. The opening line to A Day in the Life describes a dark comedy. To this day, I wonder, what was so sad about this so-called lucky man? What great fortune had turned so tragically wrong, and yet was so ironic at the same time, that it made you have to laugh? He blew his mind out in a car. He didn't notice that the lights had changed. A crowd of people stood and stared. They'd seen his face before. Nobody was really sure if he was from the House of Lords. In this second verse, we go from the dark comedy of life in the first verse to the dark comedy of death in the second. But in the third verse, we leave both the dark comedy of life and the dark comedy of death for the world of dreams, as represented by the dream world of cinema, and then in the last line, to an altogether different kind of dream world. I saw a film today, oh boy. The English army had just won the war. A crowd of people turned away, but I just had to look, having read the book. I'd love to turn you on. Lennon and McCartney deny any drug references to songs like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and Fixin' a Hole, but they have never denied the drug reference in A Day in the Life. It has been reported that the first drug reference is the line, "He blew his mind out in a car," and McCartney has confirmed in recent interviews that the line, "I'd love to turn you on," is definitely a drug reference to LSD. To sum up, a little over a minute and 40 seconds, and we have already touched on life, death, and dreams. And then the real journey begins as the orchestra takes us on what I can best describe as a sonic representation of an acid trip. This amazing orchestral glissando is the centerpiece of A Day in the Life. A lot has been written about the recording of this section. Improvisation was common for musicians playing rock and blues during this time period, but from listening to George Martin in interviews, orchestra players of that time frame had no idea how to improvise outside of anything that wasn't written out for them in advance. Both John and Paul expressed the desire to hear an orchestral build during the song's instrumental sections, but lacked a musical way to express how it should be played. To help them realize their vision, producer George Martin wrote one of the loosest and most unconventional music scores ever. He wrote starting and ending notes for 24 bars of music, with reference notes along the way as to where they should probably be for each bar. He marked the beginning of the section as pianissimo at the beginning and fortissimo at the end, which translates to start as softly as possible and to build until you end as loudly as possible. Then he told the orchestra members to do something completely contrary to all practical music thought and experience. He instructed them to not follow each other. The performance of any piece of music between two or more players requires that the players pay attention to and follow each other so that their performance locks in and syncs up. George Martin told them all to be individuals, every man for himself. If the fellow next to you is a third away from you, assume that he's going too fast and stay on your own personal course. This is contrary to the rules of any musical performance in any genre of music. I want to stress that everything I have just said has been written elsewhere, but I bring it up here to illustrate the contributions of their producer, George Martin. The song was originally recorded without the orchestra, 24 bars of count-off left open for something they would add later. John and Paul had an abstract idea of what they wanted to hear, but it took the classically trained musical mind of George Martin to bring it to fruition. To me, there is no argument who the so-called fifth Beatle was. It was George Martin. While I have nothing to back up this next statement, it seems probably likely that numerous takes of this particular section were recorded so that just the right take could be chosen. There is so much that one can visualize when hearing this section. The closest comparison that I can give to describe the mental images that hearing this orchestral section gives me is the Interdimensional journey sequence from 2001: A Space Odyssey. Sometimes I can imagine that I can see myself flying through that sonic light trip. It's the ultimate trip through time and space when suddenly it screeches to a halt and we wake up.
Woke up, fell out of bed, dragged a comb across.
And we awaken to the banality of everyday life. Or do we?
Had a smoke, and somebody spoke, and I went into a dream.
And then we are back to John and the dream. Or was that last part really the dream, and was everything previous to it reality? A Day in the Life begs the question, what is dream and what is reality? Queen would state it more plainly in their 1975 epic, Bohemian Rhapsody, which I would argue is their A Day in the Life. I would be remiss if I didn't discuss Ringo's drum performance during this song. Ringo starts by playing pianissimo. His drums begin at first by matching John Lennon's acoustic guitar strum, and by doing this, he doesn't really so much begin a drum beat as he sneaks it in. It's just a pulse, really. To quote the movie Amadeus, it begins almost comically. And then his drums take on a very classical, timpani-like feel. Oftentimes, a lead guitarist might play little melodic lead guitar breaks between the lead singer's lyrics to serve as musical bridges between the verses. Elton John does this a lot. He bridges the melodies that he sings in his verse with short piano melodies that he plays in between. Drums are not a melodic instrument. They are a rhythmic instrument. But in A Day in the Life, Ringo does this with his drums. And he does this without the advantage of having access to musical notes. After the fourth verse, the orchestral musical equivalent of the acid trip takes us on a second trip through the cosmos of our mind before landing and ending majestically on a final E major chord. Or does it end? A Day in the Life's ending chord rings on and on. As a kid, I would listen to this album with headphones and keep turning it up during its long extended fade. It's meant to give the impression that it might keep ringing on into eternity. It doesn't, of course, and yet I can't help but think that in some other alternate universe that it didn't end there. and that it was just faded out at a convenient spot for some existential universe DJ, and that in that other universe, you can fade the volume back up, and before the piano chord fades out, we hear a crossfade of that same chord playing back in reverse, and thus fades back up, transitioning into the next musical section of A Day in the Life. This crossfades into a crazy drum introduction by Ringo, and then George Harrison begins to sing about... Well, since we only know the version that exists in our universe, I think it would be pointless to talk about the version that exists in another universe now, wouldn't it? But trust me, if you ever make your way to alternate universe number X2186, check out that universe's version of A Day in the Life. It will blow your mind. In my humble opinion, A Day in the Life is perhaps one of the most amazing feats of popular recorded music in the 20th century. 50 years later, it's still above damn near anything else that has come since. When I first heard A Day in the Life, my jaw dropped. It was an utter revelation for me. I was just a kid, and my definition of pop music was very limited until I heard this song. No other song has quite illustrated the idea that in music, there are no limitations to where you can go in the way that A Day in the Life did. And no other song has quite illustrated to me the idea that pop music can be anything, and that the only rules it has are the ones that we impose on it. And so the Sgt. Pepper album comes to a close, or at least it did for many decades prior to the CD era. In addition to the album's 13 tracks, the Beatles recorded an audio tone that could only be heard by dogs right at the end of A Day in the Life, and then they recorded a bit of incomprehensible gibberish for the album's Runoff Groove. All vinyl records have what is called a runoff groove at the end of each side. The runoff groove puts your needle in a perpetual play loop so that it doesn't slide over into the actual record label and cause possible damage to the needle. If the Sgt. Pepper Runoff Groove still existed by the time I was listening to it on vinyl, it would have been completely overlooked by the existence of automatic turntables picking up the needle before I could hear it. When the album came to CD, the runoff groove was created with a fade-out. But if you play a new pressing of the album on a turntable without automatic return, it will play on and on indefinitely until you get up and take off the needle. Allegedly, it has been reported that you are hearing one voice saying, "Been so high," and another saying, "Never could be any other way." But when listening to it, it has always felt like what is being said is, "Never goose me any other way." Play it back and tell me if you hear it too. It's been so many decades since I first heard the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album. And in all those decades, I have never grown tired of hearing it. Yes, I may put it away for a while, but I eventually always come back to it. It never ceases to amaze me, thrill me, and entertain me. And when I listen to it now, decades later, I hear more than when I first heard it. The Beatles had certainly been building up to this album with their previous releases of Rubber Soul and Revolver. Their experimentation with different sounds and their cross-pollination of different musical genres was just beginning to bloom on those albums. But Sgt. Pepper blew the door wide open. I also believe that history might have gone very differently if the Fab Four hadn't stopped touring when they did, because I am certain that this album, as we know it now, would not have been possible if the Beatles and George Martin had not been able to work on it uninterrupted in the way that they did. Freed from the financial obligations of touring, the Beatles and their producer, George Martin, were given the opportunity to deliver a musical masterpiece to the world. This is TJR, and when I began this analysis of Sgt. Pepper, I asked myself, is this really a good idea? After all, what can you say about this album's songs, its song structures, and the recording process that hasn't already been said numerous times over by so many other music historians already? And so while I did bring up some facts that I'm sure you may or may not have already known, I have also tried to relate those facts to how the album resonated with me on a more personal level. I want to thank you for watching this analysis and for letting me share my thoughts on how this album resonated with me. But I want to also add that, in the end, how it resonates with you is what is most important. If you like this video, please be sure to click like, click subscribe, and click the bell icon so you can know when I release new videos. Thank you everybody so much for watching. Once again, this is TJR, and stay passionate about the music.